Today we are continuing with our week of tier lists and going for the lowest of hanging fruit, and that is the bench press variation tier list, because nobody's ever done this before. This is unique insight that you will only get on this channel. Now, the bench press is everybody's favorite lift, unless you're like me and you're a strongman hipster who thinks, I don't do the bench press, I overhead press because that's better, and everybody who bench presses is stupid. Those are thoughts that have gone through my head before, but I'm trying to do better. If you want a little more discussion about my opinions on benching and why I do it, even though I kind of hate it, I have a video up on that. But for right now, we're going to assume that you do in fact want to increase your bench press, which is a noble goal. It does lead to upper body strength. It is a good hypertrophy tool. There's a reason it has stood the test of time for so long, and there's a lot of different ways to approach it. Now, the thing with benching is that the best way, the most proven way to get your bench up, if you are a poverty bencher, is to just do a lot of it. So those of you that have really crappy benches likely haven't been doing the well thought out 2 to 3 day per week benching programs that involve a lot of practice work, a lot of volume, a lot of touches. Usually when people start to incorporate that, provided they don't have any overuse issues, they tend to do pretty well. They tend to see those numbers move. The other option, because let's face it, that's also boring as shit, is to do a higher volume approach where you focus more on building out each piece of the upper body and reinforcing the areas that just benching doesn't really target. So you're talking about something like power building, doing heavy bench work, following it up with variations, following that up with bodybuilding isolation work, because you need the rear delts and like the lower lat, and you need like the brachioradialis just developed to like give you that support you need on really big benches. Now, both approaches are viable, and which one you do is going to depend a lot on your psychology, your circumstances, what you can expect for a learning curve. Like, are you going to spend the time picking apart all of the math that goes into a high frequency approach? Are you psychologically going to commit to that for a long time? Or do you just like going into the gym and going fucking ham over a lot of exercises, and you are more likely to stick with that and progress linearly that way? Like I said, they're both viable. They just have their own sets of rules. So where the variations come in, and there's a reason bench variations are so popular, they come in because they apply to any type of bench training that you do. Even hyper-specific programs can benefit from rotating in different movements. It can shore up weaknesses. It can expose you to mechanical stress in areas where you are normally weak or normally there's a lot of momentum on the bar. So if you do something like a tempo or a Spoto bench press, then you are mechanically under tension at spots where usually you're just ripping through it. So if you do something like a tempo or a Spoto bench press where you're mechanically under tension the entire way, you're putting mechanical stress on an area that normally experiences just pure speed because you're just punching through the whole way. And also, variety offers a type of recovery. A lot of people don't really know this. There's a reason that West Siders can max every week without backsliding, because if you do it with the exact same exercise, eventually you backslide. Eventually, instead of improvements, you get stagnation, and then eventually you get worse each week. Rotating the movements allows you to hit just subtly neurologically different movement patterns, and that represents a different stress, so you can maintain that peak output week in, week out without your nervous system taking a step back. So for high frequency programs, that can be really good. I was talking to Cody that wrote the Ensons program. He reached out after the shining review I gave to it, and he was talking about the deadlift every day nonsense that he did, which is very ill-advised, but apparently it worked out really well for him. And I asked him what he thought made that sustainable. I asked like how he handled the exercises, and he says he rotated constantly, that he went from different deadlift variations, different grips, stances, heights, and that was integral to his success to getting through it alive. And apparently he ended up on the back end of that a little bit stronger. Variations are also integral in a very high volume approach because it's part of the building fatigue. When you exhaust yourself on one movement pattern, you can switch to a different one and exhaust yourself further where the other one just would have been pointless to continue putting out effort into. And the same principles of shoring up weaknesses applies, but now you have the added benefit where you can target particular muscles that these variations hit. So like a close grip bench disadvantages the triceps very heavily. So that goes good before a bunch of dedicated tricep work to just shock that area with a ton of volume. So variations are very crucial. We're going to go through my favorite ones. I'm going to rank them all S tier to D tier. So let's get started. Let's start out with the close grip bench press. Now the pros of a close grip bench press is that the elbow is very disadvantaged. So because the elbow has to go through more flexion, the tricep has to work harder. It's a long range of motion, which is very good for a default developmental movement, and it carries over to bench specific ability for almost everybody. It's universally a good go-to variation for a lot of people. It's not very high tech. And you don't want to go in super close where it's a wrist flexibility exercise. That's probably one of the cons, is that a lot of people will over-exaggerate the closeness to really hit the triceps. Wherever you grab, you just need to be several inches inside, and that will represent enough of a novel stress on your triceps to get them to grow. It's also often used for helping shoulder issues. If you have dodgy shoulders when you bench, sometimes taking the grip in can be just the thing you need to be able to get through the workload. So close grip benching, it's good. It's plug and play. You can default to that in so many programs, regardless of who you're working for. It's great for high rep work, to build up hypertrophy in those areas. It's good to precede a tricep specific workout. And it's also really good for singles, for lower rep ranges, to build starting power. If you can get real strong at the bottom of the close grip, your regular grip should absolutely fucking fly. So for that, I'm gonna give close grip an S tier. I mean, I think that's about the pinnacle of benching accessory in how many boxes it checks for how many people. Now, some people will be better off prioritizing that if this addresses particular weaknesses for them. Like if in the peak, leading into a meet, if they want to practice starting power, it can be in your best this is kind of like a deficit deadlift to your deadlift. This is going to absolutely get your starting power better, but it can also help people who have lockout issues. So there's a reason it's so versatile. But close grip benching, I think everybody should have it in phases of their training at some point. It's just so easy. And the fact that the weight has to be lightened too, that's actually a bonus. Anything that develops you while taking weight off the bar means that recoverability is going to be a lot higher and you're going to be able to feature it more often. So this is a perfect example of wedging an exercise in a high frequency approach so that you can afford yourself a little bit more recovery. The next one, we're doing board presses and floor presses. I kind of mashed them together. I know they're different movements. The difference is a floor press, your upper arms are going to rest on the ground. With a board press, the weight rests through the bar, through the actual board, through your chest. So it does feel a little bit different. And some people, because of the length of their forearms, might actually have the bar touching their chest on a floor press, so it's not an elevated movement. But they're kind of in the same spirit. A board press gives you more variation. You can go to different heights. You can really let the weight sink and then heave, although I don't really like that, but I know some people do, and that's a little bit different. But the idea is, broadly, reduce range of motion, supported, the weight gets supported somewhere else, and it allows you to practice starting power from different heights. That's what I was talking about, practicing starting power at heights where you normally have a lot of momentum on the bar. That's normally where you're just cranking through all the way. So, big fan of this work. I'm a huge fan of it for strength-specific purposes. I would tell most people to resist the urge to just have these be staples in your training. I think they're good during dedicated periods of neurologically focused work. So that's usually when you're leading into a 1-rep max attempt after you've built your base. So for a 16-week bench cycle leading into a powerlifting meet, it would be something like the last 6-8 weeks would be doing something like really heavy board presses if you're taking more of that type of block style periodization approach. If you do the power building style of training where you're just year round, we're doing hypertrophy work with heavy work to start it off, a little harder to fit this in because these aren't great hypertrophy developmental movements. Things with limited range of motion usually aren't. This is a very much an overloaded movement. So if you are going to put a strength specific movement into a more bodybuilding oriented split to call it power building, to try and hit all of those things, this would be like your one overload movement. You go a little bit heavy here, maybe do some higher rep back off work to smoke you, and then you're on to the other machine or isolation work that you would do to round yourself out. So I'm gonna give these A tier. The fact that they are so focused on strength and good at overloading, it makes them extremely useful in certain circumstances. They're just less applicable to more people, so it's less of a priority. For the people that are looking for an overload movement in a peak specific setting, or just a generic overload movement for neurological development, fantastic movement. Next, we're gonna go into incline presses. Funny story, I knew Leroy Walker a couple years back. He spent a month or so training at my gym and even did a seminar there. And right at the height, when he was still at his peak of benching before he ditched lifting to go arm wrestle, he would come in and do ridiculous feats of strength, just heaving like 650-pound bench presses like they're nothing. I think the most impressive thing he ever did is he narrowly missed a 700-pound bench in a meet, and he got it like 3/4 of the way to lockout. He did this like thumbs out grip that was popular in that area at the time in Southern California. And he swore by incline presses. He was known for having like a 675 incline press. And he would go in and just fuck the bars up at 24 Hour Fitness by doing these incline presses with 5, 6, 7 plates. But he swore that incline pressing was like an integral component of his benching. And everybody knows that incline pressing is absolutely not specific. It's an entirely different movement pattern in an entirely different direction. But because he liked the movement, he dedicated himself to it, and he got so good at it, he got good at benching by virtue of being a good incline bencher. And it begs the question, would he have been better as a bench presser if he didn't incline press? I'm inclined to think that if he took all of that effort and transferred it to flat benching, he'd probably be better. He was exceptionally specialized in incline pressing. It's not just that it was a strong lift for him. So that's kind of a funny aside, but developmentally, I think incline is very good to kind of round out your pecs, brings your shoulders into it. I like this for a recovery press movement, especially when we're doing like overhead and bench in the same workout, because it's not quite as specific to either of those. It kind of bleeds in the middle. So good hypertrophy movement, good base building exercise. In a strength specific peak, I would not include these in. I don't think it is a great strength specific exercise. Leroy would talk about the range, because it is a much greater range of motion than a flat bench. So that can be a training advantage. And he would talk about the speed he would do, because he would try to accelerate and punch through the whole way. And he thought that was a key developmental component. I'm not so sure I buy it, just because, and I would see the blowback he would get from all of the other elite benchers about his preferred method of benching. This is also a guy that was known for what he called the volume approach, where he would just do stupid repeating sets of 10 and 15 reps, things that are very not strength specific. And it begs a question, did he get good because of his training or in spite of it? I don't really know. Personally, I'm going to put incline benching as a C tier movement. I think it has a ton of value as a broad, just generic developmental movement. But for bench specific strength, this list assumes that you're oriented in increasing your overall benching strength. It has very limited application. I don't think it can really be used to address a weak point. It's just the wide range of motion, the different angle. There's a recovery component, there's variety for the sake of it, so it ranks pretty low on the list. Let's jump into one of my favorites. I've talked about this before. I've had videos up on it before. Let's talk about speed benching. So I'm specifically talking about Westside prescribed speed benching. You're in like the 55 to 65% range with some accommodating resistance usually, and it's done for like the 8 sets of 3 or 10 sets of 2, where you're just clipping off the weight super fast. I'm not talking about compensatory acceleration, which is a great thing to include into your reps. You want to practice being explosive, but I think you should practice being explosive with weights that actually slow you down. That's where you create the mechanical tension and create the type of developmental qualities you want. For as long as speed benching has been around and been talked about, the fact is very few elite world-class benchers do it. This is like a Westside specific thing. It has not been adopted by the rest of training culture at large. And you would think that if it was as effective as it was claimed to be, that it would be. But there just doesn't seem to be a legitimate transfer. And you can look further if you want to get into the science. The idea is that learning to press faster with these light weights will teach you to press heavy weights faster. There's a problem with that though. You don't reach maximal force production, where you're recruiting all of your motor units that you're able to recruit at once in a very short period of time. You don't reach that level in the time it takes you to clip off a rep. Mechanical tension is low when weights are going off really fast. So given those two facts, I'm hard pressed to think of a mechanism that would lead to that type of performance transfer. The same reason that, somebody throwing a baseball 100 miles an hour, it's not going to say anything about their actual upper body strength. Those two things start to diverge pretty quickly when you're talking about the best of the best. So anyways, I am not a fan of speed work. The most contribution I think it's given is to young trainees being influenced by it and dicking around with it when they should be just doing really good work. I'm sorry to say, guys, I'm going to put speed work D-list. I don't think it even remotely matches up to the hype. Now let's go from something that was purported to be very strength specific and move to something that's more developmentally specific. That's a guillotine press. A lot of you don't know what a guillotine press is. It's not as popular. A guillotine press is a bench where the bar comes down to your neck like a guillotine, like it's going to take you off of the head. The name should tell you, do not do this in your garage by yourself. The idea of a guillotine press, it's almost like a fly bench press hybrid. By being wide and coming out high like that, you get that stretch in your pecs. For reps, it is a brutal pec developer. And for those of you that aren't used to training your pecs, like if you bench a lot and you're very bench specific, but you've never done like the bodybuilding style upper body workouts, just throw in at the end of your workout a couple sets of 15 with like 95 pounds in a guillotine press. You'll be amazed at how much your chest cooks. I think it is an extremely good developmental exercise for people who need that at certain phases of their training. If you're in a hypertrophy phase, or if you're in just a long, undirected off season, where you don't have any immediate goals, but you're just looking for general growth, this is easy to throw in. You can put it at the end of the workout. Doesn't even have to interfere with your other stuff, as long as it doesn't bug your shoulders. If you have pre-existing shoulder issues, this might feed into that. So use it at your own risk. I think this is a really good developer. It just has limited application. It's not going to directly make your bench press stronger, unless you are so generally undeveloped that any amount of high rep work is going to do that. But to cook your pecs, to disadvantage your bench, to do something a little bit different and grow some muscle, I think this is a solid B tier exercise. I think most of you should. Again, I'm always saying you guys need to be going back to these developmental phases and taking them seriously, dealing with the pain, the burn, getting through the high reps, conditioning yourself before you go back to handling the heavy weight with all that enthusiasm. So this is a great exercise. You guys should experiment with it at the back end of your next volume upper body day. Now let's go into one of my favorites. This is something I prescribe quite a bit, a pause bench press. Big fan of pause bench pressing. Exact same reason that I like things like floor pressing or Spoto pressing. Anything that stops the bar at a point where you are used to having momentum. Normally, and it's funny that everybody touches and goes, even powerlifters will often touch and go in their regular training. I mean, most powerlifters don't touch and go their deadlifts because they know the first one has to be taken from a dead stop. Benching, paused, very different than touch and go. You get the stretch reflex at the bottom. You get the benefit of the rebound, which you can't get from a pause. So coming down, you want to hang out for at least 2 seconds to let that stretch reflex dissipate, and you'll find that pressing from a dead stop is much harder. It'll teach you to maintain position, so you'll work into your lats a little bit more. You'll keep your upper back tighter. You'll find that compression at the bottom to support the bar, which is an invaluable skill to have when you're trying to bench big weights. It's also going to condition your nervous system to fire from a dead stop. So in that way, you're training to reach maximal force production in a shorter period of time. This is more akin to the real speed work that you want to be doing. You want to learn how to aggressively break the weight fast from a dead stop. Huge neurological benefit here. I don't recommend this necessarily for hypertrophy phases. This is like entirely neurological. So this is a great peak. Again, 6, 8, maybe 10 weeks out from a meet, you're doing pause benches to just drill that impulse and to be very sport specific. So for strength development, it's good, and it's good for just about everybody because it is so sport specific to powerlifting especially, but it also will developmentally make you stronger. Not as great for hypertrophy. I'm gonna put this as a solid A tier exercise. I throw it into most of the training programs that I write for people. Pause benching is a great exercise. If you haven't included it in your training already, this is going to be a really easy way to up your bench game. Next, we're going to go into the Slinshot. So this is an overload movement. It's a form of accommodating resistance. It's essentially using bands in the exact same way. You're overloading the top by getting assistance at the bottom. It's just a little more easy to set up. It's not a pain in the ass to rig up. And I like it because the way it affects a strength curve, it's like already dialed in. When you're rigging up bands, especially in a bench, it's really hard to get the right amount of tension over the right range. You don't want the tension to hit too fast. You don't want it too heavy. Slinshot is like just the right amount of tension. So I like it for that. And I've actually gotten some value out of it. For what it does, I think this is an easy way to utilize accommodating resistance to temper you to heavier and heavier weights. But it's something that should be used sparingly. This shouldn't be just a default go-to movement in your training. Again, this is neurological. You're learning to push faster through heavier weights. They get heavier as you go through the range of motion. You're learning to physically handle that load in your hands. You're changing your perception of what's heavy. That is neurological. That is strength specific, which means you have to be careful with how frequently you put that in and how long you run it for. Great for a peak phase. Great for that last bit of training before you're really trying to test your strength. I think it can be overdone though, and I think in the past a lot of people have overdone their Slingshot training. I'm going to put this as solid B tier, just because it's easy for newbies to get into and overuse because everybody likes benching 50 pounds more than they actually do. It can stroke your ego. The thing that makes it accessible is the same thing that makes it dangerous for most people. But in the right context, when you are in that phase of training where you know you're coming up on a new 1 rep max attempt in the next 6 or 8 weeks, this can be a very useful tool. I really like Slingshots. For as much shit as people talk about Mark Bell. Now let's get into Swiss bar benches. So a lot of the easiest variations are changing your grip, going narrow, going wide, going neutral. Using a Swiss bar is something that can help hit the triceps in a different way. It can actually help alleviate tension in the shoulders. I know when my shoulders have been buggy, Swiss bars have been one of the few movements I could do. I'd hit a little lower, keep my elbows tucked a little bit more, and my shoulder pain wouldn't prevent me from pressing. And that change of direction, really good for the long head of the tricep, really good to overload the delts, anything where the bar comes lower and you're tucked. So I do like Swiss bar stuff for that. I think that this is another solid developmental exercise. You can actually use these both for hypertrophy and for a neurological drive, for getting yourself to push through, using that long head of the tricep to really drive through those big weights. If you're in a high frequency type program, this is the type of variation you can include to get that little bit of recovery I was talking about. I really like Swiss bar. I don't know anybody that swears by them for fixing some problem they had, but as a default variation, I think it's really good. I'm gonna give that B tier status. Now we go into wide grip benching. So this is kind of the opposite of close grip benching, right? Again, going wide, the hands coming out wider, the pecs can have to work a lot harder to push through, a lot more range in the shoulder, a lot less range in the elbow. So it's a great pec developmental exercise. And again, just another default. This disadvantages you, so you're going to have to work harder, so you're going to get stronger. The same way when you're doing a 13-inch deadlift or a 2-inch deficit deadlift. It's just a change for the sake of it. As far as weaknesses, you can argue that it does hit your pecs a little bit more, so it can help out with that starting power if you have an underdeveloped chest. When people have an underdeveloped chest, I think a lot of isolation work is warranted. I think people really sleep on what things like flies and even machine presses can do, Smith machine, on keeping tension on the pecs and getting them to grow beyond what a bunch of barbell variations will do. This will hit the pecs, but if that is a weak area for you, I think you're better off focusing on developmental movements rather than weak point focus movements. However, as a default rotation, same thing I said about close grip and Swiss bar, it is a good way to just change up the movement pattern to get some recovery in a high frequency style of training. So I think wide grip benching is very good. Be really careful about your bicep tendon, your pec insertions. If you have shoulder issues, sometimes this aggravates that on people. So scale up at an appropriate pace. Don't bounce these. I mean, that's a pec tear waiting to happen. Move them under control. Use your lats to build tension. But beyond that, wide grip benching, it's a great default movement. Not super specific. I wouldn't put this at the heaviest range of your training, and it might be problematic for some people. But for what it is, solid developmental movement, I'm going to put that B tier. Next, we're going to a decline bench press. Declines are in every gym, and the only people that use them are people that have no business using them, and I don't know anybody good that uses them. Bodybuilders like them. I think diehard bodybuilders live by it for the angle it hits the chest, but we're talking about performance here. Not a fan of decline benching whatsoever. It does allow you to overload, but there are so many ways to overload your bench that are more specific to the pattern of movement you're actually going to go through that I actually think this just throws you off. It's too different. I think it's an ego move for a lot of people. Developmentally, for the sake of benching a lot of weight, I don't think it does a lot at all. It is a different angle. It's a novel stimulus, so there's some points there. I'm going to put it D tier. I think there's so many other productive ways to incorporate variety into your training that I think putting decline in is a waste of time. I think most people just do it because they want to handle more weight. All right, going into tempo presses and Spoto presses. I'm going to marry those two things together. Spoto presses are stopping an inch or two below your chest. That was heresy for the longest time. Bodybuilders would do that and they get shit talked to them because they were only coming down to parallel. They weren't touching their chest, and real bench pressers touch your chest because that's how it's done. And even though these bodybuilders would get big and strong as shit, people would be like, well, every set is a test and you're cheating. So Spoto comes out of nowhere. He was a bench-only gym rat out of Vegas, I think, and broke the bench record out of nowhere. And he used that style of pressing to build a fuck ton of mass on his frame. So they called it a Spoto press, even though that method of benching has been around for a very long time. Again, great way of putting tension on areas that typically don't experience tension. You have to consider the whole movement. When you come down, something's happening. When you stop, something's happening. When you get started, something's happening. And then there's as you glide through. That's very different than the change of direction. The lift starts with the change of direction. So you need to be comfortable putting in movements that do strain you at those points that can potentially become weak, the points where you can blast through if it's on the way up to lockout, but when you You stop there, you try to press from there, there's no handle, you feel weak. That's how you develop the ability to have more mastery over the movement, to cut through stick points, to stay with those grinders where you don't reach a point, because you want to get stronger, stronger, stronger. Every inch is mechanically stronger. So if you get to a point and the bar just comes back down, that tells you you're weak there. So things like Spoto and tempo presses do that. So they're great developmentally, talking about more time under tension. High reps with Spoto presses, going to light your chest up. This is something I would even prioritize or pair with a wide grip bench. I prescribe a lot of like close grip Spoto benches because changing direction above your chest, a lot harder than most people think it is. Great developmental movement. If you go heavy, learning how to change direction with a lot of weight that far off your chest, again, great variation option for high frequency type programs, but also great hypertrophy option for more high volume kind of power building style programs. Big fan of Spoto benches. I'm gonna put that A tier. There's a reason that it's named after the man who's one of the best bench pressers ever. Moving on, we're going to accommodating resistance. I put bands and chains as being a little different than Slingshot. I mean, the Slingshot is just friendlier. It's easier to rig up. Like I said, that strength curve is more even. You can't see, but this guy has a shit ton of chains hanging from the bar. Accommodating resistance can be useful. It is entirely neurological. So trying to punch through these increasingly heavier weights, it teaches you to hit the gas the whole way. So that compensatory acceleration is very valuable, especially if you're a power athlete. I think it gets misused, and I think it's complicated in a way that makes it not appropriate for a lot of people. I think very few people have business relying on accommodating resistance. If you're in an athletic program that prioritizes speed and the coach is writing the program, maybe. If you are an elite bencher and this is a style of training that you're comfortable with, maybe. For most people, the key to the bigger bench press is more size on your frame. For most people. As you get a little more advanced, there's weak points you can target, and your ability to ram through and keep ramming through, that might be something that you diagnose and you think, if I can get better at that. Chains can be very effective to teach compensatory acceleration, to get you to not coast. A lot of us are guilty of just kind of coasting the whole way up. Like once it gets going, we just stay with it. And you want to learn how to punch. You want to learn how to hit the gas and keep hitting the gas, because that's how you punch through stick points, and it increases rate of force development. So it increases the number of motor units you can pull at once, but also the rate at which you do that, which is how you develop maximal strength. So it's a useful tool. I just don't believe it's necessitated for most of the people that are looking for ways to increase their bench. I think it's a lot more specific, it's a lot more complex. I think it's a pain in the ass to set up, to keep track of, to get the tension right. So there's a reason I think it pops up a lot in conjugate style training, because you don't have to keep track of it. You just rotate it in depending on whatever variation is up for this week. So this is another one. When I look to the best benchers in the world, I don't see a ton of people leaning heavily on chains and bands, but I see a lot of people that are not great benchers doing them religiously in very small, like powerlifting style gyms. I feel like it has much more become a gimmick than it has been an established way to predictably develop a really big, really strong bench press. I'm going to put this C tier. I think it can be very useful for the right specialized athlete who is training in a very specific context. But I think for everybody else, I think it's a big distraction, and I think it takes them further away from the type of work that's going to develop a big, formidable upper body that can support a lot of weight. That's my 2 cents on accommodating resistance. Now let's go into pin benches. I'm a big fan of pin benches, and these are kind of in the same world as floor presses and board presses. The pin presses I'm talking about specifically are bottom up, and that's what makes them different. You set the bar at whatever height, usually an inch or two above your chest. I rarely go above that, but you crawl under the bench, you find your tightness, you grab the bar, you build the tension, and you find your angle that you're gonna press through. 1, 2, 3, ease in and break, slam to lockout. Teaching you to press again from a dead stop without the benefit of lowering. Not only do you not have stretch reflex, you don't have the movement pattern, the clean movement pattern of I'm coming down vertically, now I'm going up vertically. So you're gonna find in the beginning that you tend to skip. So there's a little bit of skill required to getting it right. You'll push in just the wrong direction, and you'll kind of get stapled, and you'll have this long grinded press. So it's another example of, again, lighter weight doing a lot of work for you. As you build that skill and you get more comfortable, the weight is going to climb and it's going to now be an overload movement. Huge neurological component to this. I'm a big fan of these. I think a lot of people have slept on these. Robert Wilkerson did these. He would refer to them as dead presses. I think it's just a great exercise, specifically for neurologically focused work. It can be really easy on the shoulders, which is a plus. Just like the other neurologically focused stuff, you're gonna wanna put this more in a strength-focused phase of training. I would not recommend having these as a staple year-round or in a developmental block of training. So these are gonna get solid A tier. Just know when to put them in. Very, very good exercise, very underutilized exercise. As long as you're not getting crazy with the height, you are going to dramatically increase your ability to punch weight off your chest. So that's all I got for today, guys. Go ahead and ignore these at the bottom. These are repeat images of guillotine press and like a tempo press, which I already covered. Organizing the tier list pictures apparently is too complex for me. So there's always like one thing lagging at the bottom that I didn't get to. So that's gonna stick in the back of your teeth like popcorn from the movie you saw the night before. Let me just clear these out really quick. Guillotine press, Spoto and tempo presses. Boom, there we go. Now we did it. It's complete, it's done. Thanks so much for watching. Leave your questions and comments in the comment section, or better yet, take them to Patreon, where I upload my training on a daily basis with commentary so you can see how I put these principles into action in real time. Don't forget to check out Kong at EmpireBarbellStore.com. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Till next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.